All right, we are all working on sustained practice. So this is some lit, sustained reading material. I will vary the speed, so hopefully there'll be a little something something for everybody. I am reading from the Justice Coalition's Victims Advocate. This is volume 20. If anybody likes to keep up with them on their own after listening to the articles, you can go to justicecoalition.org and look up their Victims Advocate publications. All right, here we go. Ready and begin. Her near-death experience brought life by Lisa Root. She's a store owner and a businesswoman. She's a lady and what some would admiringly call a diva. She's a mother and a friend. She is a contributor to the community and a survivor of domestic violence. 15 years ago, Sylvia Treasures could not have imagined being where she is today. She had moved to Jacksonville, Florida, from California to seek a new beginning in life after a rocky start to adulthood. She gave birth to a son her senior year of high school, still graduating with a GPA of 4.0, and within a couple of years had fallen in love with a married and married a man she believed was a loving and suitable fit for her life. After a few months, Sylvia discovered her courtship with him had been tainted by his secret relationship with another woman. So she made the decision to pack her belongings and move with her young son across the country to live with the grandparents who had raised her as a little girl in her parents' absence. However, the idea of Sylvia's move did not sit well with her husband. Unwilling to be left behind, he convinced Sylvia he was sorry for cheating and wanted to make their life together work. He was coming to Florida with her. As much as she wanted to remove herself from the issues, Sylvia desired a successful married life and family, so she said yes. In her mind, anyone who would uproot his life and leave behind so many people, so many family and friends to live 3,000 miles away, knowing only her, must truly love her and want their marriage to be successful too. This success was not to be. Sylvia and her husband both worked and became involved in the community through a growing West Side church. Right living did not change the person her husband was, though. Despite all he had left behind in California, his desire for other women came with him. And for Sylvia, that meant more heartbreak and a lot of questions. He answered her questions with lies, mental and emotional abuse, physical abuse, and a near fatal episode. If a man hits you once, he isn't going to stop, she said. The first time a man ever puts his hands on you should be the very last time. If he sees you stay and forgive him, it's easy for him to do it again. Sylvia reached out for help, but was encouraged to stay in her marriage and to make it work as a devoted Christian. She grasped the concept and longed for its reality, but understood it takes two. Not everyone wants to be helped, she realized. But in spite of all her prayers and her efforts, had God let her down? A few days after making the bold decision to leave her husband and living under threat of murder for doing so, Sylvia received a visitor at her job. Working at the St. Mary's Stockton Street Mary Ann's kitchen her grandfather owned. The sound of her husband's kind voice and sweet talk mingled with her hope to work things out as well as her need for transportation. And before she could change her mind, she was getting into their only car and heading home. Only this time her hope for change was quickly squelched as they drove off and his hand connected hard with her face, making her a bloody mess. He yelled at her that this was it. He was going to kill her. He spelled out his maniacal plan to end her life as he drove to the darkened area of McCoy's Creek Road. Sylvia sat in sheer terror as the husband of her youth was suddenly fixated on killing her. He pulled over to the side of the road near the creek and, grabbing the steering wheel's locking device, known as the club, ran around to the passenger side. She thought quickly to jump to the driver's seat and drive off, but he was too quick. He was at the passenger side in seconds, pulling her out of the car as she screamed for help. The last thing she saw as she raised her hands to shield her head was his enraged face and the club poised above her head. In that split second, she called silently upon the God she knew. Lord, please don't let me die like this. The next few seconds seemed an eternity of darkness and silence. The next thing she saw astounded her. I opened my eyes with my hands over my head, wondering when the blow was coming. I saw my husband on his knees, crying. The club had fallen to the ground like something had forced it from his hand, she recalled. I knew God heard my cry for help and spared my life. Her would-be murderer was on the ground, sobbing remorsefully and threatening to drown himself in the creek. Sylvia found the wherewithal to help him into the car and drive to her grandparents' house. She did not press charges, though he had been in and out of jail over the years for abusing her. Somehow they stayed together on and off for nearly a year after that. But something was different. She had found strength, and that strength compelled her to leave, this time for good. One Wednesday night, he slapped Sylvia while she was driving her family to Bible study. Her son cried out from the back seat, "My mama always be so nice to you, and you always be so mean." That was it. She and her son got out of the car at a traffic light and made their way back to a store where she called the police. Back at home, in the care of a female officer, she was given shelter information with a warning. "If you are coming back here, don't waste my time," she said. "Too many times I come back to see the woman leaving in a body bag." Sylvia and her son filled up a garbage bag with clothes and left with the officer. Days later, she was at Hubbard House, Jacksonville's battered women's shelter, where they remained 6 months, allowing her to save money for her own place. Her husband went to jail but was released and sentenced to anger management classes. Neither of them ever looked back. Today, Sylvia is a force to be reckoned with. She discovered her value and refuses to let anyone alter that again. Her greatest hope is to empower women by helping them realize their worth and the love of the one who created them. She believes valuing and loving oneself is the key to avoiding abusive relationships. Years after finding her strength, her voice, and her place in the world, and using her business, Dainty Treasures, a local dress shop, to minister to women, she is standing up in the community to speak out against domestic violence. In fact, she will speak this month at the Hubbard House 20th Annual Barbara Ann Campbell Memorial Breakfast, sharing her story of victory so that other women will know they too can overcome and that there is truly life after domestic violence. All right, we are moving on to the next article. Here we go. Ready and begin. Human Trafficking Crime Organization dismantled. Orlando, Florida. The Orlando Metropolitan Bureau of Investigation, MBI, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, and Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi's Office of Statewide Prosecution recently announced that charges have been filed and arrest warrants have been issued against 3 Central Florida defendants for human trafficking, for commercial sexual activity, human trafficking for labor and services, and deriving support from the proceeds of prostitution. Human trafficking is an abhorrent crime, and thanks to this collaborative effort, the Orlando area men have been arrested for their role in an alleged human trafficking organization, Bondi said. Richard Rawls, date of birth 6/8/39, was at the center of the investigation. He is a violent career criminal with 47 felony and 10 misdemeanor arrests for crimes such as robbery, sexual battery, child abuse, cocaine possession, and other charges. His associates, James Bernard King, date of birth 5/3/64, and Wilbert Shaver, date of birth 1/6/53, were also charged with human trafficking and other charges related to this investigation. These charges are a result of an MBI investigation. The investigation revealed that Rawls was actively recruiting female prisoners from Lowell Correctional Institute State Prison for Women in Ocala, Florida, and was transporting those women to Orlando after their release. The defendants advertised the females on prostitution websites and transported them to locations in Central Florida to commit acts of prostitution. Female victims were repeatedly provided narcotics, including cocaine and heroin, and were not allowed to leave the residence unless they were escorted by one of the defendants. Several of the victims were threatened and beaten by Rawls and King. MBI requests that anyone with additional information related to this human sex trafficking investigation please contact MBI at 407-836-9701 or Crime Line at 407-423-TIPS. TIPS. The Metropolitan Bureau of Investigation is a multi agency narcotics, vice, and organized crime law enforcement task force organized and assigned to Orange and Osceola counties. Next article. Prostitutes, Victims of Human Trafficking, Part 2. New Police Tactics by J. Howell. Recent dramatic changes in national and state laws on human trafficking have led to significant changes in the way law enforcement agencies deal with the issue of prostitution. In 2010, the police department in Anaheim, California, analyzed the specifics surrounding their past prostitution arrests and concluded that the individuals charged with this crime were actually sex trafficking victims. Human trafficking is using force, fraud, or coercion to recruit or provide a person for sexual exploitation. In over 100 prostitution arrests in Anaheim, most of the men told the police that prostitution was not their career of choice. A majority of the prostitutes interviewed by the vice investigators believed that selling themselves was their only alternative for survival. Many of them came from dysfunctional homes, had few friends or family members who cared about them, and were addicts or alcoholics. Most of the women were between 18 and 29 years of age. Their vulnerability attracted pimps and sex traffickers who often relocated the women before exploiting them in an abusive relationship. Tragically, out of fear or a desire to be cared for, sex workers often protect their pimps. Many of the prostitutes talked of daily physical abuse, emotional dominance, and lies about caring. The Anaheim police knew that traditionally the role of law enforcement agencies has simply been to arrest hookers. These tactics did not result in any substantial changes in the sex in the sex trafficking business. After its extensive analysis, the Anaheim Police Department dramatically changed its approach and viewed prostitutes as potential human trafficking victims. They began to assist the women in escaping prostitution and to help them appreciate the circumstances that led to their arrest. The police provided services to assist the prostitutes in redirecting their lives. They also sought the women's cooperation and participation in pursuing criminal charges against the pimps. Their new human trafficking approach initially surprised the local district attorney's office. Pimping and pandering prosecutions were rare when the new system started. During its first year of operation, the program's vice detail saved 29 women from their traffickers. Almost 40% were under 18 years of age. 77% were missing persons. The sex traffickers had transported 81% of them out of their home counties. The new approach included interviewing the women in a special room assigning and working with victim advocates and volunteers to assist the prostitutes, and prosecuting the pimps and traffickers. One of the prostitutes told the police she was under the control of a violent and physically abusive pimp. A physical examination revealed a fractured orbital socket, burn marks on her legs, and strangulation marks on her neck. Her victim advocate helped her with a safe housing option, food and clothing. She testified at the trial of the pimp, where a charge of attempted murder brought a life sentence. The victim advocate and vice officers maintained contact with her and helped her reconnect with her family. She is now pursuing a new career. 2 years after the initiation of the new approach, 38 pimps have been arrested and charged. 20 were convicted and 18 were awaiting trial. The Anaheim Vice Detail rescued 52 human trafficking victims. Only 4 are known to have returned to prostitution. The new approach by the Anaheim Police Department is reported in the March 2013 FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin. Because of its dramatic success, law enforcement agencies around the country will be using it as a model for the effective investigation and prosecution of human trafficking. All right. Next article. Sentenced to death by electrocution, but my taxes paid to keep him alive, by Lisa Root. For the murderer of your wife, Shirley Turner, you are committed to the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections for a term of your natural life. Judge John Southwood said, his gaze solidly fixed on the defendant's cold, smirking face. He slowly leaned back in his large leather chair, letting his head tilt upward as if to keep hot tears from spilling over the rims of his eyes and down his cheeks. Silent anticipation filled the courtroom. The only sound that could be heard was the long, slow intake of the judge's breath. And for the murder of Joyce Brown, he said, the words coming out in a strong and steady exhale, I hereby sentence you to death. Stunned gasps and quiet sobbing could be heard by families of both the victims and the defendant. The judge continued, it is the judgment of this court and sentence of the law that you be kept in close confinement until the date of your execution, that you be put to death by having electrical currents passed through your body in such amounts and frequency until you are rendered dead. May God have mercy on your soul. Words of utter condemnation for a man who donned military fatigues and armed himself with a shotgun and a 15-inch army knife that hot summer July morning in 1984. Under the cover of darkness, William Thaddeus Turner watched the house of his estranged wife and 7-year-old daughter lived in with Joyce Brown and her teenaged daughter after Joyce had found the two on the streets 8 months earlier. They were hungry and scared, having no idea where they would live or how they would survive until Joyce met them and took them in. Turner was bitter that his wife of over 10 years had left him, and, though he had badly abused her, was convinced she left him to have a lesbian affair with Joyce, whom she had previously never known. It took him 1 month to discover where they were living, and in short order had secretly moved in down the street from them and began harassing and stalking them, even once hitting Shirley with his car and threatening to kill her. He kept a notebook documenting their every move. The morning of his crime was no different. Man leaves through front door, 3:45 a.m. The last journal entry read, describing the activity of Joyce's fiancé who was heading to his job. Turner sat quietly in full view of the house, letting his many thoughts permeate his mind until it reached a boiling rage. The details of his diabolical plan concluded, and with the benefit of the barely breaking dawn, he moved stealthily toward the front yard, found a phone line, and cut it. The shotgun he carried was one he had stolen from his father. It was loaded with shells, emptied of the usual pellets, and filled instead with lead fishing weights for maximum impact. All right, continued on page 4. Page 4. All right, here we go, continue. Turner fired his first shot through a front window and made his way around the entire house, shooting out all the windows before blasting down the front door. He saw Shirley run across the hall into a bedroom and stormed in after her. The two young girls were in the room. The teenager hid under the bed, while his own young daughter watched the unfolding events in horror. Turner shoved his wife to the floor and began stabbing her, screaming his rage at her, with his daughter pounding her tiny fists on his back, imploring him to stop hurting her mother. Joyce's attempts to call for help were futile, and she rushed frantically through the opening where the front door had been, down the street to the nearest payphone, about 2 doors down, in front of a small corner grocery store. She closed the door to the booth and called the operator. Though police were eventually dispatched to her Monroe Street home, just 2 blocks from where the new courthouse sits today, they did not arrive soon enough. With his wife dead, Turner headed out the door after Joyce. While she was still on the phone begging for help, he pushed the door of the phone booth open, grabbed her by the hair, and stuck the knife into her neck, cutting from one side of her head to the other. Though the cut wasn't enough to kill her, the sound the knife made was loud enough to be heard by the man on the other end of the dangling receiver. Turner pushed her to the ground where she fought and begged for her life while he furiously stabbed her more than 50 times with the army knife that was longer than a ruler. The medical examiner later reported that Joyce remained alive as he plunged the knife repeatedly into her body. Neighbors watched in disbelief, some throwing rocks and whatever they could find at Turner to make him stop. According to witnesses, Turner stopped once to hide behind a building when a police car passed by, then returned to continue his sickening quest. Police arrived on the macabre scene to find him straddling her, the bloody knife poised above her mangled body. Seeing their guns pointed at him, Turner pleaded with them not to shoot. Then he ran. The police caught and arrested him. The state attorney's office tried him. The doctors determined he was not mentally ill. The jury found him guilty. The judge sentenced him. He went to prison and awaited death. Death that, according to the judge, was to come by electrocution. However, 30 years and 27 days after his disgusting and despicable crime, William Turner died peacefully in his jail bed. "I know it's not the Ritz-Carlton," Joyce's daughter said quietly, "but he had shelter he didn't pay for. He died in his bed with his covers on him. The families are left behind to suffer. If we can't pay our electric bill, the electric company will let us sit in the dark. This man never had to worry about lights, water, food, nothing. And 7 cents of every dollar I've spent paid to keep him alive." Joyce Brown's family wants to know why. Why his death sentence was never carried out. The requirement of the law was not met. The victim's family's tax dollars helped pay for him to live free from financial burden and responsibility. A man whose case was open and shut was allowed so many appeals that he lived 30 years and died in peaceful slumber. Why? Duval County Circuit Court Judge Lawrence Haddock, who presided over an evidentiary hearing during William Turner's murder trial, said, "Hard to explain to the public, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Your Honor. However, it would seem the supporters of the death penalty might be encouraged by a law signed June 14, 2013 by Governor Rick Scott. The measure, dubbed the Timely Justice Act by its proponents, requires Florida governors to sign death warrants 30 days after the Florida Supreme Court certifies that an inmate has exhausted his legal appeals and his clemency review. Once a death warrant is signed, the new law requires the state to execute the defendant within 6 months. Amid allegations by those who oppose the death penalty that the law will, quote, fast track, end quote, death penalty cases, Governor Scott responded with a signed letter stating that this new law, quote, discourages stalling tactics, end quote, of defense attorneys and ensures that the convicted, quote, do not languish on death row for decades, end quote. Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rianda, who is known for his unflinching support of the death penalty, expressed his disgust over the ridiculous amounts of court motions that are filed by attorneys following a death sentence and believes this new law is having an impact. John Guy is the assistant state attorney assigned to Turner's appeals in recent years. When asked why someone who is caught in the act, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to death is allowed so many appeals, he responded, quote, "The appellate process in death cases is very lengthy and complex. Death cases are appealed at the state level and the federal level, and unfortunately, they can take decades to resolve." End quote. The Timely Justice Act speaks of someone on death row exhausting his appeals, begging the question, exactly how and when does one exhaust his appeals? Quote, "I don't think there is a precise answer to that due to changes in the law and evolving methods of execution. Attorneys for death row inmates typically file appeals until the execution itself," Guy said. A June 2013 article in the Miami Herald states, quote, "Florida leads the nation in exonerating death row inmates, having released 24 prisoners from death row in the last decade, while 154 inmates have been on Florida's death row 20 years and 10 have been there for more than 35 years. The average time for appeals run 13 years, which is below the national average of 14.48 years." End quote. Opponents of the bill fear there could be some innocent people awaiting execution and the new bill will limit their chance to prove their innocence. But the bill's supporters say that the ability to exonerate the innocent will not be hampered by the faster appeals process and argue that it will restore the deterrent value of the state's death penalty, the article further stated. "We are not short on anti-death penalty zealots in Florida, but most people in Florida think it's unreasonable to put people on death row 20 to 25 years when their sentence was not in question," says Representative Matt Gaetz, Gaetz, the House sponsor of the bill. "The jury decided William Thaddeus Turner should die. The judge agreed and justly sentenced him accordingly to the law. But Turner never saw the electric chair. His victims were stalked, terrorized, and deliberately and inhumanely stabbed to death in front of their children and neighbors while begging for their lives. Their murderer died in his prison cell, begging for nothing. He lived and made appeals at the expense of Florida's taxpayers. You paid for it. Was justice served? You decide." Hold on, this says on a lighter side, so let's read it. Here we go, ready? Begin. On the lighter side, a former sergeant in the Marine Corps took a new job as a high school teacher. Just before the school year started, he injured his back. He was required to wear a plaster cast around the upper part of his body. Fortunately, the cast fit under his shirt and wasn't noticeable. On the first day of class, he found himself assigned to the tough students in the school. The smart aleck punks, having already heard the new teacher was a former Marine, were leery of him, and he knew they would be testing his discipline in the classroom. Walking confidently into the rowdy classroom, the new teacher opened the window wide and sat down at his desk. When a strong breeze made his tie flap, he picked up a stapler and stapled the tie to his chest. Dead silence. The rest of the year went very smoothly. Nice.
That was great.
That's nice.
bring plan. Oh.
All right, I hope you took speed finger breaks in between and enjoyed the sustained read. Make sure you stretch it out. Stay healthy and stay speedy.